At Christmas, my parents turned my 11-year-old away at the door and told her to go home alone. I didn't hear it from them. I saw it. I saw my daughter standing under the porch light of our house when she was supposed to be across town, asleep on a couch surrounded by cousins and wrapping paper. I was driving back late, thinking about nothing in particular, already planning to turn off the lights so I wouldn't wake anyone. The street was quiet, snow pushed into thin gray ridges along the curb. Then I saw her. Mia wasn't crying. That was the first thing that registered. She was holding a gift bag with both hands, gripping it the way you grip something when you're afraid of dropping it, and afraid of being told you didn't hold it right. Her hat was pulled low. Her shoulders were tucked in, like she was trying to make herself smaller in case someone was still watching. She didn't rush toward me. She waited until I was close enough to hear her without raising her voice. They said tonight wasn't a good night, she told me. She said Grandma opened the door and looked past her, like she was checking something behind her shoulder. She said Aunt Karen smiled and said, "This isn't the time," and added that Mia made things feel heavy. Like it was weather. Like it was a mood someone could just decide not to deal with. They asked her to stand outside for a minute, just while they figured things out. She waited. She could hear laughing inside. Then my father came back and told her it would be easier if she walked home. He said it wasn't far. He said she was old enough to manage. As she spoke, I could see it without being there. The doorway. The warmth behind it. The curtains pulling together. Mia turning away with the bag still upright. The tissue paper neat, careful not to make a mess of the gifts no one wanted. And starting down the sidewalk by herself on Christmas night. We went inside without talking much at first. I set the gift bag down on the kitchen counter and took her coat. It was still zipped all the way up, like she hadn't been inside anyway long enough to take it off. She stood where I left her, hands at her sides, waiting. I noticed her shoes were damp along the edges. Snow melts into that darker line when it's been walked through instead of brushed off at a door. I asked her to sit. She pulled the chair out carefully and sat straight, feet tucked back under the rung. When she started talking, it came out in short pieces, spaced apart. Not rushed, not hesitant either, just measured. She said Grandma told her there weren't enough chairs at the table, not enough space. She said it like she was quoting instructions. She didn't look at me when she said it. She watched the corner of the counter where the laminate was peeling, the spot we always forget to fix. I asked what that meant. She shrugged once, small. She said everyone else was already there, the cousins, Aunt Karen, someone from Karen's side I'd never met. She said Grandpa told her they'd make do, but then said it might be better if she didn't stay, that it would be crowded, that she'd be more comfortable at home. I asked how long she stood outside. She thought about it. Said maybe a few minutes. Long enough for her fingers to get cold through her gloves. Long enough to hear laughing inside, someone dropping a fork. She said Grandma closed the door part way while they talked. Not all the way, just enough. She told me she asked if she could call me. Her phone had died in the car earlier, and she hadn't thought to charge it because we were only supposed to be there a few hours before bedtime. She said she asked to use the house phone. Grandpa said no. He said it would make things more complicated. He said I was probably busy. He said walking would clear her head. She repeated his words exactly, like she didn't trust herself to change them. Then she mentioned the gifts. She nodded toward the bag on the counter. She said she tried to hand them over before she left. The ornament she made for Grandma. The scarf she saved for and picked herself. She said Grandma told her to take them back. Said they didn't have room for more things right now. Mia lined the bags up by the door before she left because she didn't want them tipping over. She made sure the tags were still facing forward. I didn't interrupt. I noticed the clock over the stove clicking over to the next minute. The refrigerator hummed and stopped. She finished and waited again, hands folded this time, like she was done with her part. I looked at the chairs around our table. We have 4. One of them wobbles if you lean too far back. We've managed birthdays, homework nights, Neighbors stopping by without warning. We pull another chair from the bedroom when we need it. Sometimes we sit on the couch with plates on our laps. We make space. Mia hadn't said anything dramatic. She hadn't said they were mean. She hadn't asked why. She just told me what was said and what was done, in order, the way you'd explain a route you walked once and didn't plan to take again. After she finished, the room settled back into its ordinary sounds. The clock kept time. The heater clicked on and off the way it always does when the temperature drops fast. I stood up and walked into the kitchen without saying anything, mostly because there was something in the air I hadn't noticed before. Not strong, just there. A thin, bitter smell that didn't belong to the house. The pan was still on the stove, not on heat anymore, just sitting there, dark at the bottom. Whatever had been inside cooked past recognition. I lifted it and set it in the sink. The metal made a dull sound against the basin. On the counter next to it was a plate with a few crumbs and a smear where something had been spread and scraped back off. A fork lay beside it, turned the wrong way, like it had been dropped and not fixed. I asked her when she'd eaten. She said she hadn't really. She said she'd tried. She said she'd watched a video first. One of those short ones that promise simple results if you follow the steps. She pointed at the phone charger plugged into the wall and said she'd turned her phone back on just long enough to look it up, then turned it off again to save the battery. She didn't say which video. She didn't need to. I opened the window a crack to let the smell out. Cold air pushed in right away, clean and sharp. She pulled her sleeves down over her hands and watched me do it. I noticed then that the light over the stove was still on, the bright one we don't usually use unless we're cooking something that needs watching. She said she got hungry after she got home. She said she waited a while first, just in case I came back early. When I didn't, she figured she should make something. She told me she thought about cereal, but decided it didn't feel right. She wanted it to feel like Christmas. She said that part carefully, like she wasn't sure if it sounded silly. I didn't answer right away. I took the pan and filled it with water. The burned part didn't lift. I set it aside and wiped the counter. There were faint circles where something hot had rested too long. I recognized them from other nights. School nights. Rushed dinners. Nothing unusual. She said she was sorry about the pan. She said she didn't mean to ruin it. She said she tried to flip whatever it was too early and it stuck. She said she should have waited longer. She said next time she'd know better. I told her we could talk about it later. Not because there wasn't anything to say, but because later felt like the right place for it. She nodded and accepted that. She slid the chair back in when she stood, lining it up with the table leg the way she'd been taught. I poured 2 glasses of water and handed her one. She held it with both hands and took a small sip. Then another. The glass left a ring on the table. She wiped it with her sleeve without being asked. The gifts were still by the door, lined up the way she'd described. The tissue paper hadn't shifted. The tags were still facing out. I hadn't noticed them when we came in, or maybe I had and didn't let myself stop there yet. She sat back down and looked at the table, not at me. She said she thought maybe Christmas felt different because she was older now. She said maybe it was supposed to feel quieter. She said she might have expected too much. I stood there listening, the window still open, the cold working its way in, and let her finish. She wasn't asking a question. She was accounting for something, trying to balance it in her head so it would make sense. She finished speaking and went quiet, like she'd reached the end of what she was responsible for saying. The window was still open. The cold had settled along the floor by then, moving in slow, steady lines. I walked back and closed it most of the way, leaving it cracked just enough that the smell wouldn't stay trapped. The latch clicked softly when I let go. I didn't reach for my phone. It was on the counter, screen dark, right where I'd left it. I could have picked it up without thinking. Muscle memory would have handled that part. But I didn't. I stood there a moment instead, listening to the house come back to itself. The heater kicked on again. Somewhere outside, a car passed, tires hissing on wet pavement. I filled the kettle and set it on the stove. The sound of water hitting metal was louder than it needed to be. I turned the flame down after it caught, the way I always do. Mia stayed at the table, hands folded, watching the steam begin to gather on the spout. She didn't ask what I was doing. She already knew. I took the cocoa tin from the cabinet. It's dented along one side from being dropped years ago, and the lid doesn't seal unless you press it just right. I scooped carefully, leveled it with the back of the spoon. Milk from the fridge, still cold enough that the glass fogged in my hand. Ordinary steps. Familiar order. She apologized again, quieter this time. Not for the pan, for making a mess, for not waiting longer, for not knowing what to do. I nodded once, not because I agreed with any of it, but because I heard her. I set the mugs on the counter and poured slowly so it wouldn't splash. We sat down together at the table, not across from each other, side by side. The chair legs made that small scraping sound they always make, no matter how gently you move them. I slid one mug toward her and waited until she wrapped her hands around it before I took mine. She drank carefully, blowing across the surface first, then taking small sips. A bit of foam clung to the rim. She wiped it away with her thumb and then on her sleeve. I noticed she didn't reach for the marshmallows. They were still in the pantry, unopened. I didn't mention them. I didn't ask any more questions. I didn't go back over what she'd already told me. There was nothing new to add in that moment, and pressing for more would have turned it into something else. She leaned slightly toward me, just enough that our arms touched. Not clinging, just there. At one point she said she hoped Grandma wasn't upset with her. She said it quickly, like she was testing the words to see how they landed. I told her to drink her cocoa while it was still warm. She did. The steam curled up and disappeared. The gifts stayed by the door. I didn't move them. I didn't suggest opening any of our own. The tree lights were on, blinking through the living room doorway, but we didn't turn them off or make a show of them either. They just stayed on, doing what they do. Eventually, she rested her head against my shoulder. It wasn't dramatic. It didn't come with a sigh or a sound, just a small shift of weight. I adjusted my arm so it was easier for her to stay there. I sat with her like that for a while, long enough for the cocoa to cool, long enough for the house to feel steady again. I still didn't pick up my phone. Some things don't need to be answered right away, to be answered fully. After a while, Mia's breathing evened out. Not asleep exactly, but settled. I stayed where I was until she lifted her head on her own and said she wanted to change into her pajamas. I nodded and watched her walk down the hallway, the cuffs of her sleeves brushing the doorframe as she passed. When her bedroom door closed, I finally stood up and rinsed the mugs. I left them in the rack to dry instead of putting them away. It felt unnecessary to finish that part. I didn't think about my parents right then. Or maybe I did, but not directly. What came up instead were older scenes, the kind that don't announce themselves. They just step forward when there's room. Growing up, there was a phrase my mother liked to use when relatives were around. She'd say I was the determined one. It sounded like a compliment if you didn't listen too closely. What it usually meant was that I needed more reminders, more supervision, more correction. Karen, on the other hand, was easy. That was the word everyone agreed on. Easy to please, easy to show off, easy to forgive when she forgot something or spoke out of turn. At school events, teachers would comment on Karen's confidence. At home, my parents would tell me to watch and learn. When Karen brought home a good grade, it was expected. When I did, it was noted, like an improvement. No one said any of this harshly. It was all done in passing, folded into conversations about dinner plans and errands. By the time we were adults, the roles were already set. Karen moved through things with a kind of assumption that there would be room for her. I learned to check first. When I told my parents I was pregnant with Mia, my mother sat down. Not in a dramatic way, just like she needed to brace herself. My father asked how I planned to manage. He didn't wait for the answer before listing what I hadn't considered yet. Money, time, reputation. Karen hugged me and said we'd figure it out, then left early because she had plans. They helped, technically. A crib that had been stored in their basement, a few bags of clothes already sorted by size. Advice, always advice. It came with conditions, though they weren't spelled out. Gratitude was expected. Independence was encouraged, as long as it didn't inconvenience anyone. Every offer had an edge to it, like it could be taken back if I didn't handle it correctly. When Mia was little, my mother liked to tell people how much work babies were. She said it lightly, laughing, as if she were sharing a universal truth. She'd look at me when she said it, not unkindly, but pointed. Karen would nod, sympathetic, then talk about how busy she was with her own life. I learned early not to ask for too much, to accept what was offered and fill in the rest myself. It kept things smooth. It kept conversations short. Standing in my kitchen that night, listening to the house settle, I saw the line clearly. Not as a revelation, just a confirmation. This hadn't started with a closed door. It had started years ago, in smaller moments that were easier to overlook. Back then, it was me being asked to try harder, to adjust, to understand. This time, it was my daughter being told there wasn't space. The thought stayed with me while I finished up in the kitchen. It didn't press. It didn't demand anything right away. It just sat there, steady. When I passed Mia's room, her door was cracked open the way she likes it. The light was off. I paused long enough to listen. Her breathing was even now. That was enough. I took my phone from the counter and stepped into the living room so the sound wouldn't carry down the hall. The tree lights cast a soft pattern across the wall, blinking in their own quiet rhythm. I scrolled once and stopped on Maggie's name. I hadn't planned to call her that night. It just felt like the right order of things. She answered on the second ring. She always does. The screen filled with her face, closer than I expected. She had her glasses on and her hair pulled back, neat, like she'd been reading. She didn't smile right away. She looked at me, then past me, taking in what she could see. "Where's the kid?" she asked. I tilted the phone toward the hallway and told her Mia was getting ready for bed. Maggie nodded once. Then she said she wanted to say goodnight to her. So I walked the phone down the hall and tapped on the door. Mia sat up when she heard Maggie's voice. She smiled, small but real, and scooted closer to the screen. They talked for a minute about nothing important. About the cookies Maggie had planned to make. About the snow. Mia kept her answers short. She said she was fine. She said she was just tired. Maggie listened without interrupting, her eyes steady. Then Maggie asked how dinner was. Mia hesitated. It was brief, but it was there. She glanced at me once and then back at the screen. She said she didn't eat much. She said she tried something new and it didn't turn out. Maggie waited. Mia's voice shifted, not louder, just thinner. She said she went to Grandma and Grandpa's house like she was supposed to. She said they told her it wasn't a good night. She got through most of it before her voice stopped cooperating. She pressed her lips together and tried again. She said Aunt Karen said she made things feel heavy. She said Grandpa told her walking home would be good for her. She said it wasn't far. Maggie didn't say anything while Mia talked. She didn't ask for details. She didn't fill the pauses. When Mia finished, she looked down at her hands, still holding the phone, like she'd handed something over and wasn't sure what would happen next. Maggie leaned closer to the camera. Her face didn't change much, but everything about it slowed. She asked one question. Who decided she couldn't come inside? Mia didn't answer right away. I did. I said the names plainly. Maggie nodded again, once, like she was confirming something she already suspected. She looked back at Mia and told her she hadn't done anything wrong. She said it evenly, without emphasis, like stating a fact that didn't need defending. Mia's shoulders dropped then. Not all the way, just enough to notice. Maggie told her to go to sleep. She said they'd talk soon. Mia nodded and handed the phone back to me without a word. When it was just the two of us on the screen, Maggie asked where I was sitting. I told her. She asked if Mia could hear us. I said no. She took a breath and let it out slowly. I gave them that house so there would be room for family, she said. Space was the one thing they weren't supposed to run out of. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't ask what I planned to do. She just said she needed to think. She said she'd call me back. Then she looked straight at me and said, "I won't allow this." The screen went dark. I stood there for a moment longer, phone still in my hand, listening to the quiet stretch back into place. I stayed where I was after the call ended, phone still warm in my hand. The living room looked the same as it had an hour earlier. Tree lights blinking, one strand slightly dimmer than the others. A folded blanket on the arm of the couch that I kept meaning to put away. Nothing had shifted, but the air felt rearranged, like furniture moved just enough that you notice it later when you reach for something and it isn't where you expect. Maggie didn't call back that night. I didn't expect her to. When she says she needs to think, she means it. She's always been deliberate that way. Not slow, just careful. I rinsed the sink, turned off the last light, and checked on Mia once more before going to bed. She was asleep on her side, one arm curled under the pillow, her face relaxed in a way it hadn't been earlier. I pulled the door mostly closed and left the hall light on low. The next morning came quietly. No rush, no immediate aftermath. I made coffee and stood at the counter while it brewed, watching steam collect on the window. The phone stayed where it was. I didn't reach for it. I knew if something was going to happen, it wouldn't come through me first. Maggie called mid-morning. Her voice sounded the same as it always does. Clear, awake. She didn't ask how Mia was. She didn't need to. She went straight to what she wanted to say. She told me she'd been thinking about the house, the one my parents live in now, the one everyone refers to as a gift. She said she'd never liked that word much. It implied something finished. She said what she'd done was allow them to live there. She said there was a difference, even if people preferred not to notice it. I leaned against the counter and listened. She didn't rush. She explained it the way she explains anything practical, like how to adjust a recipe, or why a certain route is better even if it looks longer on a map. She said permission isn't the same as ownership. She said it can be changed. She paused then, long enough that I thought the call might have dropped. Then she said she was going to fix it. She didn't say how. She didn't say when. Just that she was going to fix it. I asked her what that meant. She said it meant looking at paperwork. She said it meant checking names and dates and signatures. She said people get comfortable when things have gone their way for a long time. They stop reading closely. They assume. She didn't sound angry. She sounded precise, like someone reviewing a list they'd been meaning to get to. I told her she didn't have to do anything on my account. She said she wasn't doing it for me. She said she was doing it because a child had been told there wasn't space. She said she'd been very clear about why she made certain arrangements, and if those reasons were being ignored, then the arrangements needed to change. We didn't talk much longer after that. She said she'd handle it. She said she'd let me know if she needed anything. Then she told me to lock my doors that night, the way she always does, as if the world might decide to get careless if you don't remind it you're paying attention. After the call, I sat at the table with my coffee and waited for it to cool. I watched the minute hand move on the clock. I didn't call my parents. I didn't warn them. There was nothing to say yet. Whatever Maggie was doing would speak for itself. That afternoon passed the way afternoons do when you're not looking for them to. Mia did homework at the table. I answered emails. We ate leftovers for dinner. Outside, the snow started again, light and steady. Somewhere else, paperwork was being opened. Somewhere else, assumptions were being tested. I didn't know the details then. I just knew something had been set in motion, and it wasn't going to announce itself until it was ready. The next morning didn't arrive with any sense of urgency. It looked ordinary enough. Light through the kitchen window, the same quiet street. I made breakfast and packed Mia's lunch before I noticed my phone still hadn't moved from where I'd left it. I checked it then. No missed calls, no messages. Maggie usually calls early when she wants to talk. By mid-morning, the silence felt out of place. I tried her number. It rang until it stopped. I tried again, slower this time, like that might make a difference. Nothing. I told myself she'd set it down somewhere and forgotten it, which wasn't unusual. She's careful with important things and casual with the rest. Still, it stayed with me. After I dropped Mia at school, I drove to Maggie's apartment. It's a short drive. I know the turns by heart. When I parked, I noticed her window blinds were open. She never leaves them open when she goes out. I knocked. Waited. Knocked again. The hallway was quiet in that weekday way. Most people gone. The building holding its breath. I unlocked the door with the spare key she'd given me years ago. The one she said was for emergencies or when she locked herself out, which she did more often than she admitted. The apartment felt wrong right away. Not messy, just incomplete. Her wheelchair wasn't by the wall where it always sat. The blanket she kept folded over the back was gone. The small overnight bag she used for appointments wasn't in the closet. Her coat was missing from the hook by the door. The kitchen table was clear. Too clear. Maggie doesn't leave a table like that. I stood there longer than I needed to, taking it in piece by piece. The place didn't look disturbed. It looked decided. I stepped back into the hallway and knocked on the door across from hers. The neighbor opened it part way, hair pulled back, already dressed like she'd been up for hours. She looked at me for half a second before speaking. "Your parents were here early," she said, "before breakfast." I asked what she meant by early. She said she was taking her trash out when she saw them, their car parked crooked, Maggie in the chair, Richard talking fast, Evelyn holding Maggie's bag. She said Maggie didn't look happy. She said she didn't hear everything, just enough to know it wasn't Maggie's idea. I asked if she knew where they were taking her. She shook her head. She said she assumed it was family business. She said Maggie didn't wave back. I thanked her and went back inside the apartment. I closed the door and leaned against it for a moment, phone already in my hand. I called my parents. No answer. I called again, straight to voicemail. I didn't leave a message. When I picked Mia up from school later, she asked if Maggie had called. I said not yet. She nodded and looked out the window. She didn't ask anything else. That night, I sat at the table and tried Maggie again. Nothing. I tried Richard's number, then Evelyn's. The calls stacked up unanswered. The house felt smaller than usual, like the walls had shifted inward when no one was looking. This wasn't about a misunderstanding anymore. It wasn't about hurt feelings or crossed lines. Someone had decided Maggie couldn't be left to make her own choices. Someone had decided to move her without asking. I didn't know where she was. I only knew she hadn't gone willingly. And I knew, in a way that didn't require words, that whatever Maggie had set in motion had been noticed. By the next morning, waiting didn't feel like caution anymore. It felt like avoidance. I packed a bag for Mia in case we needed it and left it by the door. She noticed and didn't comment. We've always been good at reading each other's silences. I drove to my parents' house just after noon. Their street was busy in the way it always is after holidays. Cars half unpacked, people carrying boxes back inside. I parked at the curb and walked up the path I'd walked 100 times before. When I knocked, my mother answered quickly, like she'd been standing close to the door. She stepped into the doorway before I could see past her. I asked where Maggie was. She told me to lower my voice. She said Maggie was resting. She said this wasn't a good time. I asked again. She repeated herself, slower. I told her I wanted to see Maggie. She shook her head once and said no. Not firmly, just final. My father appeared behind her then, staying far enough back that I couldn't quite read his face. He didn't say anything. I stepped off the porch and took my phone out. I dialed and waited. I didn't pace. I didn't explain more than necessary when the dispatcher answered. I said my grandmother had been removed from her home without her consent. I said her mobility equipment had been taken. I said I was being refused access. My mother laughed once, sharp and brief, like I'd made a mistake in front of company. I ended the call and waited. The officers arrived without noise. No lights, no urgency. They asked a few questions. I answered them in order. My mother talked over me once and was asked to stop. When they asked to see Maggie, my mother hesitated, long enough to matter. Then she stepped aside. Maggie was in the back room, seated in her chair, blanket folded across her lap. She looked smaller than she does on a screen, but her eyes were clear. When she saw me, she nodded, like she'd been expecting this moment and was relieved it had finally arrived. One of the officers knelt so he was level with her. He asked if she was there because she wanted to be. Maggie didn't answer right away. She looked at my parents first, then back at him. "No," she said. "I'd like to leave." My mother started to speak. The officer raised a hand. Maggie repeated herself, a little louder this time. The room adjusted around that sentence. Space opened where there hadn't been any before. They didn't hurry anyone. They didn't lecture. They just made it possible. I brought Maggie's chair out to the car. She settled into the passenger seat with care, the way she always does, as if she's making sure she hasn't forgotten anything important. We drove straight to her lawyer's office. He was there already, jacket off, files open. Maggie wasted no time. She asked him to explain, again, what my parents had been calling a gift. He did, calmly. The house wasn't in their names. It belonged to a trust Maggie had set up years ago. My parents were listed as future beneficiaries, nothing more. While Maggie was alive, she could change that. My father stared at the floor. My mother kept her arms crossed, like posture might count as a defense. Maggie listened, asked one clarifying question, and then told him what she wanted changed. Names were removed, new ones added, dates initialed, papers signed. When it was done, she looked at me and said she was tired. I helped her up. We left without saying anything else. No one followed us. After that day, things didn't collapse or explode. They rearranged themselves, quietly. The trust paperwork moved through its process without drama. There were envelopes in the mail, phone calls returned by assistants instead of voices I recognized. I didn't track every step. I didn't need to. Maggie did. She kept a folder on the small table by the window and added to it as things arrived, smoothing each page before placing it inside. She moved in with us a week later. Not because she had nowhere else to go, but because it made sense. We cleared out the spare room. I lowered the bed and moved the dresser closer to the wall so she could reach it from the chair. A ramp replaced the front step. The bathroom door was widened. Grab bars went in where the towel rack used to be. None of it felt symbolic. It was just work that needed doing. Mia adjusted faster than I expected. She showed Maggie where we kept things, explained the rules of the house as if they were important enough to state out loud. Maggie listened. She followed them. In the mornings, they sat together at the table while I made coffee. Sometimes they talked. Sometimes they didn't. Both seemed acceptable. I didn't hear much from my parents after that. A few messages came through, carefully worded, then stopped. Karen sent one email that said she hoped everyone was well. I didn't reply. There wasn't anything to clarify. Winter passed. Spring came in its usual uneven way. Maggie took her chair out onto the sidewalk when the weather allowed and watched the neighborhood change color. Mia did homework at the same table she always had. The gifts from last Christmas were put away in a closet, still intact. We didn't make a point of opening them later. They belonged to that night. The next December arrived without ceremony. We put the tree up the weekend after Thanksgiving. The lights worked on the first try. Mia unpacked the ornaments carefully, one by one. When she reached the one she'd made the year before, she held it for a moment, turning it over in her hands. Then she hung it on a branch near the center, not too high, not hidden. Maggie reached out and adjusted it slightly so it faced forward. She didn't say anything when she did it. Mia watched her hands and nodded once, like that was all that needed to happen. On Christmas Day, we set the table early. I pulled the extra leaf out without thinking about it. There were enough chairs. No one counted them. We ate slowly. Plates were passed. Someone laughed at the wrong moment and then again because of it. The door stayed closed, but not in the way it had before. It stayed closed because everyone who needed to be inside already was. That night, after the dishes were done and the house had settled, I stood in the doorway and looked back at the room. Maggie was asleep in her chair. Mia had left her ornament on the tree. Nothing felt triumphant. Nothing felt unfinished either. No one stood outside. No one had to ask for space. And no one needed to explain why they belonged.